It was October 31st, and the town seemed to hold its breath, a strange hush settling in as the day edged toward midnight. We'd moved into the old Talbot house just a few months back, a rambling, almost ancient-looking place on the outskirts, near the edge of a dense forest that everyone said led nowhere. But what really unsettled me was the cemetery nearby, tucked away, as if it was hoping to be forgotten. All month, neighbors had thrown us strange looks, a mix of pity and unease. The only time someone actually said something was in a hushed, hurried tone: "Keep your doors locked on Halloween, and keep away from the cemetery at midnight." It sounded like a ghost story meant to scare newcomers, especially since it had been a couple of decades since anyone last lived in the house. But as Halloween night approached, my husband, our kids, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. We chalked it up to the stress of moving, mixed with the eerie isolation of the house, and the quiet dread that the chill of autumn nights brought. At 11:45 p.m., my husband and I were winding down in the living room, the kids already fast asleep. The wind howled outside, and the thick oak trees cast long, twisted shadows across the yard, contorting under the pale moonlight. I remember thinking that the shadows looked almost alive. Then came the first unexpected sound, a dull, resonating thump from outside. My husband stiffened, his face mirroring my own apprehension. Another thump echoed, louder this time, seeming to come from somewhere near the edge of the property. Against my better judgment, I rose, moving toward the window. My breath hitched as my eyes locked onto the cemetery. Despite the distance, I saw faint shapes moving, shifting in the dark. It looked as if the ground itself was shivering, a faint tremor that sent a jolt of fear racing down my spine. And then, as the clock struck midnight, I saw something I can never forget. One by one, the graves started opening. It was impossible, surreal, like a nightmare had wrapped itself around reality. Skeletal hands emerged, followed by half-decayed bodies, some still clothed in fragments of the past. They crawled out with slow, methodical determination, like they had done this before, as if bound by some ancient and terrible ritual. My husband grabbed my arm, his voice a strained whisper: "We need to wake the kids and lock everything. Now." We moved through the house as quickly and quietly as we could, locking doors, bolting windows, our breaths shallow and hurried. My son groggily asked what was going on, but I just whispered that it was a game, a Halloween tradition to stay quiet and hidden. And then came the voices. The voices started as whispers, faint and broken, drifting through the night like a sinister lullaby. They seemed to come from every direction, blending with the moan of the wind and the rustle of leaves, swelling until they filled the house. My husband's hand tightened on mine as we both strained to make out the words, though a part of me didn't want to know. "They will pay. All of them. Their debt is due." Just as my daughter's eyes grew wide with fear, there was a sharp knock on the front door, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. It was neither the wind nor a trick of the night. I saw the color drain from my husband's face as he mouthed, "Do not answer." I nodded, clutching the kids close as we backed away. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, fiercer, until it felt like something was slamming against the door with relentless force, as if whatever was on the other side was determined to get in. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the pounding ceased. Silence filled the room, thick and choking, until a crash shattered it. The back door had burst open, swinging wide to reveal the figures outside. And they weren't just shadowy shapes anymore. They were people, sort of. Some of them looked barely human, their faces a patchwork of bone and rotted flesh, eyes hollow but filled with purpose. They moved with an eerie fluidity, stepping across the threshold as though they belonged here, like this was as much their home as ours. One of them paused at the entry, eyes narrowing as they looked around, and I swear it seemed to recognize the house. It stepped forward, and for a moment, under the hallway light, I caught a glimpse of what used to be its face, a twisted, tormented figure with half its jaw hanging loose, eyes glowing with rage. "We know you're here," it hissed, voice a raw rasp, thick with malice. "This time, there's no hiding." In that moment, something in my memory stirred, a vague recollection from when we were moving in, a story that the realtor had glossed over but didn't quite manage to hide. This house, our house, had once belonged to the Delaney family. Years ago, they'd vanished, leaving behind only whispers and grim legends. Some people said they'd been cursed, forced to pay for some dark betrayal buried in the town's history. And every Halloween since, a family had disappeared from their home, pulled from their lives like they'd never existed at all. My husband's voice broke through my frantic thoughts, low and trembling. "We need to find whatever they want. This isn't random, they're here because of something in this house." The kids clung to me as he sprinted down the hall, frantically tearing through drawers, bookshelves, and the cellar door, searching for anything that might break the curse, uncover the truth, anything that would make the relentless undead stop clawing at the walls and creeping ever closer. But as he rummaged, something strange happened. The air around us grew colder, and the lights began to flicker, each flash revealing ghostly forms drifting closer. One of the figures stretched out a bony hand toward me, and my breath froze in my chest as a voice rasped in my ear, "Run all you want, but we always find you." With nowhere to run, we backed into the old parlor, huddled against the walls as shadows slid across the floors and the icy whispers grew louder. Each flicker of light revealed faces pressed against the windows, sunken eyes, torn mouths, the hollow remnants of lives long extinguished. It felt like a nightmare made flesh, closing in on us, the room thick with the scent of earth and decay. "Mom?" My son's voice trembled as he pointed to the large, ornate mirror hanging above the fireplace. The mirror had come with the house, dusty and cracked, with carvings of twisting vines and clawed hands around the frame. Now, in the dim light, it seemed to pulse, its surface rippling like disturbed water. I stepped closer, squinting, until I realized that the mirror wasn't reflecting us at all. Inside, another world stretched out, a ghostly, warped version of our house. And there, in the mirror's depths, I saw figures moving. They weren't reflections, they were memories, moments caught in time. The Delaney family moved through the rooms, living their lives as if unaware of the terror surrounding them. They laughed, celebrated, and then screamed. As I watched, the mirror world shifted, showing the Delaneys trapped in the same parlor, just like us. The mother was crying, clutching her children close, while the father frantically scribbled something onto the wall. Then, with one final, desperate scream, they were pulled into darkness, leaving nothing but their blood-stained words etched into the wallpaper. They were the last family to live here, and now they were reaching out to us, pleading from beyond the grave. "Look," my husband said, his voice barely above a whisper as he pointed at the faint lettering now visible on our own parlor wall. It was an ancient message scrawled in dark red, nearly faded with time. I moved closer to read it, the words chilling my blood. "To break the curse, face the mirror and say their name. Only the innocent may release the damned." Before I could ask him what that meant, a chill crept over me, and I felt bony fingers brush against my shoulder. I spun around, heart pounding, but nothing was there. The whispering grew louder, chanting, "Say our names, remember us." One name after another echoed from the walls, their voices growing more desperate, like they knew that tonight might be their last chance for freedom. But each name was foreign, strange, old Delaney. Barrows, Marchwood, families, generations of them, all claimed by whatever dark force gripped this place. I turned to my husband, my voice trembling. "We have to find who's truly innocent, someone who's never broken a promise, never betrayed a soul. It's the only way to lift this." We looked down at our kids, who stared back at us with wide, frightened eyes, and in that moment I knew what I had to do. I took a deep breath, pulled my daughter close, and whispered, "Do exactly as I say. Walk to the mirror and say their names." She hesitated, but I gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. The mirror's surface rippled in response, the faces inside leaning forward, their hollow eyes widening with something that looked like hope. One by one, she repeated their names, her innocent voice filling the room, breaking through the haunted air. The mirror trembled, almost humming with energy, and then it cracked, releasing a piercing wail that reverberated through the entire house. And that's when the true horror began. The mirror exploded outward, shards raining down around us as the figures began spilling into the room, their bony hands reaching, their empty eyes fixated on us with a hunger that no words could describe. They weren't here to be saved, they were here for revenge. They screamed in unison, a deafening wail that shattered what little sanity I had left. As they reached out, one of them, a figure with a twisted, skeletal face and hollow sockets, whispered, "Tonight we finish what began centuries ago." The room filled with a thick, suffocating darkness as the wraiths closed in, their skeletal hands stretching toward us, cold and relentless. They weren't just angry, they were ravenous, as if their very souls had been starved for centuries. I stumbled back, clutching my daughter close, her face buried against me, muffling her terrified whimpers. My husband grabbed my son, pressing him close to his chest, whispering for him to keep his eyes shut. But no one could block out the sound, the mournful, guttural chant that rose from every spirit's lips, echoing through the room. Bound in blood, sealed in shadow, one family must pay. I didn't understand until I saw the shadow. The very darkness around us began to shift, coiling and twisting, almost as if it were alive. Then I saw it, a figure, formed from pure shadow, towering over the specters, watching us with eyes like twin voids. The air grew colder as the entity's voice slithered into our minds, low and deadly. "You've come to my house. Do you understand the price of trespass?" I tried to find my voice, trembling as I managed to speak. We didn't know. We didn't know anything about this place." The shadow figure tilted its head, and in the dim light, I saw something like a smile, thin and jagged, like it had been carved into the dark. "Ignorance does not absolve your family," it hissed, each word dripping with venom. "You must pay, unless you are willing to make a new pact." The word pact echoed through the room, chilling me deeper than the icy fingers still reaching for us. The spirits paused, their hollow eyes flicking from us to the shadow figure, almost reverent, almost afraid. "What kind of pact?" my husband demanded, his voice wavering. The shadow figure's gaze bore into him, intense and ancient. "One family leaves," it whispered, "if another takes their place." We exchanged horrified looks. The entity wasn't just a vengeful spirit, it was something much older, a keeper of this cursed ground, a creature bound by dark laws we could barely comprehend. "But who?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Who would take our place?" The shadow seemed to grin wider, and then the walls of the room shifted, revealing scenes from other times, other families. I saw a mother clutching her children just like I was, her eyes wide with terror. I saw fathers, brothers, daughters, all bound by the same curse, pulled into this cycle of endless torment. But there was something else. As I looked closer, I saw familiar faces, one after another, generations of people from this very town who had been complicit in keeping the legend alive. Names I knew, people I passed in the grocery store, who whispered warnings but never enough, just enough to ensure that each year, a new family unknowingly took the place of the last. They were in on it, using us to keep their own hands clean. "They sent us here on purpose," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a slap. "The whole town. They knew." The shadow figure seemed pleased, its eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. "You see the truth now. The town, bound to protect itself, gives me fresh souls to bind to this ground. But if you refuse, then all of you will be mine before dawn." I felt a sickening twist of rage and despair. They'd set us up, lured us to this cursed house, so they wouldn't have to pay the price themselves. My husband grabbed my hand, squeezing it tightly as he whispered, We're not going to be their sacrifice. But the wraiths began to surge forward again, their patience wearing thin, and the shadow figure's voice grew low and demanding. Your time runs thin. Choose now, bind another family to take your place. Or join us in eternal darkness. Just then, my son spoke, his voice trembling but defiant. What if we end the curse? What if we break it once and for all? The shadow figure laughed, a horrible, echoing sound that rattled the walls. Foolish boy, it sneered. No family has ever succeeded. The secrets are hidden deep in this house, the truth buried beneath blood and lies. But in his words I felt the faintest glimmer of hope. My gaze landed on the mirror's shattered remains, and through the glass, I glimpsed a door, faint and hidden beneath the rubble, something I hadn't noticed before. I looked at my husband, who nodded, and with a burst of desperate courage, we turned and ran, dragging the kids toward it. The spirit screamed, the shadow figure bellowed, but we didn't stop. I pushed the door open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling down into darkness. And as we descended, I could feel them behind us, the restless dead, the furious guardian of shadows, all descending into the depths to make us pay for daring to defy them. The staircase plunged into a suffocating darkness, twisting deeper than seemed possible. Each step echoed, amplifying our terror, until it felt like we were walking straight into the heart of something ancient and malevolent. Shadows crept along the walls, reaching for us with gnarled, spectral fingers, and I swore I heard whispers, the voices of those who died here, taunting, pleading, warning. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a cavernous chamber lit by a strange, flickering light. The walls were lined with faded portraits of past families, their eyes hauntingly aware, as if they could see us. There was a worn stone altar in the center, its surface carved with twisted symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. A sickly, greenish light seeped up from between the stones, illuminating a small, leather-bound book resting on the altar. The air felt thick and suffocating, charged with something older than time. My husband looked at me, his face pale. "That has to be it," he whispered, nodding at the book. I approached the altar, my hands trembling as I reached out. Just as my fingers brushed the cover, a bone-chilling scream echoed through the chamber. A figure lurched from the shadows, a gaunt, twisted man with empty eyes, his skin stretched tight over a skeletal frame. His mouth gaped open, bloodied and cracked, as if he'd been screaming for centuries. "They didn't finish the ritual," he rasped, his voice a guttural wail. "They left us here, all of us, bound to this curse. Do you think you'll be the ones to break it?" His question hung in the air, mocking us. But I steeled myself, fingers wrapping around the book. I opened it, finding pages filled with words written in a language I couldn't understand. The writing seemed to writhe and shift, almost as if the words were alive, resisting my gaze. "What do we do?" my husband whispered, panic edging into his voice. Then my daughter's small voice broke through, steady and soft. "I can read it, Mom." I looked at her, stunned. How do you know?" She shrugged, her eyes transfixed on the pages, like she was seeing something I couldn't. "I don't know. But it feels like I know the words, like they're in my head already." Before I could protest, she began to recite the strange incantation. Her voice was barely a whisper at first, but with each word, it grew stronger, resonating through the chamber. As she read, the ground began to tremble, and the green light from the altar pulsed brighter, casting sinister shadows around us. The twisted figure screamed, clutching his head, and one by one, other figures emerged from the walls and floor, decayed, spectral forms from across generations, their faces contorted with agony. They swarmed toward us, reaching, clawing, trying to silence the words spilling from my daughter's mouth. "Keep reading," I shouted, shielding her with my body as my husband and son tried to hold back the advancing spirit. Each word seemed to burn them, turning their outstretched fingers to smoke and ash, but still they came, relentless and furious. With a final, echoing word, my daughter's voice rang out, filling the chamber with a blinding white light. The specters recoiled, shrieking, their forms breaking apart into wisps of smoke that spiraled toward the ceiling, vanishing into the darkness. The earth shook violently and cracks splintered across the walls, but the altar remained steady and unmoving. Then, the chamber was quiet, too quiet. My daughter collapsed against me, breathing heavily, and I felt her tiny heart racing against my chest. For a moment I thought it was over, that we'd succeeded. But as I looked back at the altar, the shadows began to reform, swirling into a shape that towered over us, a monstrous figure with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched into a horrifying grin. It was the Shadow Guardian, the entity that had bound all these souls, watching us with a gaze filled with ancient malice. "You think you've won?" it whispered, its voice a venomous hiss. "I am older than time, stronger than death itself. I will not release you. Not now. Not ever." Suddenly, the book in my hands began to burn, the pages curling and turning to ash in seconds. A faint inscription remained, glowing on the altar beneath the dying embers of the book. "Only blood repays blood." The realization hit us all at once. "The curse won't break unless someone willingly sacrifices themselves," I whispered, my voice hollow. The Shadow Guardian laughed, a low, chilling sound that echoed through the chamber. "I will claim one of you," it sneered, the shadows around it writhing hungrily. "Choose, or I'll take all of you." My husband stepped forward, jaw clenched, and I saw a fierce determination in his eyes. But before he could say a word, our son pushed past us, standing before the shadow. "No!" I cried, reaching for him, but he turned to us, his face resolute, his eyes brimming with tears. "If I go, you'll be safe," he whispered, his voice small but strong. "I'm not afraid. Someone has to end this, right?" My heart shattered, a scream dying in my throat as the Shadow Guardian's smile widened, stretching impossibly across its face. It reached out a skeletal hand, its fingers curling around my son, who looked back at us one last time, a quiet smile on his face. Then, in an instant, he was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The chamber fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting as the Shadow Guardian dissolved into nothingness, taking the curse with it. The walls stopped trembling, the ground steadied, and for the first time, the room was filled with a heavy, grief-stricken silence. It was over, but the price had been too high. The silence was thick and smothering. My son was gone. The chamber's shadows receded, leaving nothing but empty walls, but they left a gaping void in my chest that I knew would never close. My daughter clung to my side, her face streaked with tears, and my husband stood, staring blankly at the spot where our son had just been. We turned to leave, our steps slow and hollow, as if each one echoed the finality of what we'd just lost. As we climbed the spiraling staircase back toward the surface, the air grew colder, like the curse's touch lingered in the very walls. But something felt wrong, like we weren't alone. In the hallway at the top of the stairs, a shadow flickered across the cracked mirror. I froze, staring, and the reflection stared back, a boy's figure, standing just behind me, watching. My son. My heart twisted painfully. "Alex," I whispered, my voice breaking. But as I turned, he was gone. My husband grabbed my arm, his face pale. "We need to leave, now. Whatever's left here." "It's not him." The house groaned around us, as though it could sense our fear, the floorboards creaking under each step, the walls shuddering with a low, haunting vibration. But then we heard it, a soft, familiar voice, echoing faintly down the hall. "Mom, Dad. Don't leave me." It was Alex's voice. My husband went rigid, his grip on my hand tightening as he looked down the hall, his face a mix of horror and hope. It's a trick," he said, but his voice shook. "It has to be." But my feet carried me forward on their own, my heart hammering, my mind desperate for any chance, any hope that my son was somehow still with us. I moved closer to the hallway, where shadows danced and the walls seemed to breathe. Then he appeared. Alex stood in the hallway, his eyes wide, his face pale and scared. He looked just as he had minutes before he'd sacrificed himself, and he held out his hand. "Please. I don't know where I am. I don't know how to get out." My daughter whispered, "Mom, don't." But I couldn't stop myself. I stumbled forward, reaching out, my hand brushing his as a cold chill ran down my spine. I grabbed him, pulling him to me, his small body trembling in my arms. "Alex," I choked. "Oh God, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry we let you." But then, slowly, his arms tightened around me. His fingers dug into my skin, harder and harder, cold as ice, until they felt more like claws than a child's hands. I tried to pull back, but he wouldn't let go. "Mom." His voice rasped, but it wasn't his voice anymore. It was guttural, hollow, dripping with malice. "You shouldn't have brought us here. I paid the price, but it wants more. It always wants more." I pulled back, his face contorting into something twisted, a horrific blend of my son and something far darker, something ancient. The realization hit me: Alex's sacrifice had appeased the curse, but it hadn't freed him. It had turned him into something else, binding his soul to this place, making him a part of the darkness. He grinned, his teeth sharp and gleaming, his eyes hollow as he whispered, "We're all here, Mom. All the ones who paid the price. We wait until the next family. But you'll always be mine." I staggered back, horrified, as he stepped toward me, the shadows lengthening behind him. My husband grabbed my arm, pulling me away, his eyes wide with terror. "We have to go now." We ran, the walls shaking, the doors slamming behind us as we fled. I could feel Alex's presence behind me, his voice echoing through the house, growing louder with each step. "Don't leave me, Mom. Don't leave me here. Not alone." We burst out the front door into the night, the wind howling, the graveyard looming behind us, filled with the countless souls trapped by the curse. But even as we stumbled down the driveway, gasping for breath, the house's windows glowed with a faint, ominous light. And in one of them, I saw him, my son, standing alone, watching us leave, his face twisted in a look of sorrow and rage. As we reached the street, I could still hear his voice, soft and cold, drifting through the air, haunting and eternal. "Next year, when the clock strikes midnight, I'll be waiting." We never looked back. We left that cursed town, abandoned everything we'd known, but it didn't matter. Because every night, in every shadow, in every creak of the floorboards, I heard his voice. And every Halloween, as the clock struck midnight, I knew he was there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting for us to return.